Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between podcast. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and medium, and here we explore life, death, consciousness, and what it all means. Sylvia True was born in England to parents who were refugees from Germany. She moved to the U.S. when she was 5. Growing up with parents from different cultures, a mother who was a Swiss champion figure skater and a father who was a theoretical nuclear physicist, gave her varied and unique perspectives. During her summer breaks, Sylvia likes to travel to the Amazon and do research in the rainforest. She has raised 2 daughters, both pursuing their passions. Presently, Sylvia lives in Massachusetts with her husband and 2 spoiled dogs, where she is a high school chemistry teacher. Where Madness Lies is her new book that is available from Top Hat Books and wherever books are sold. So welcome, Sylvia, to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to thank you all for your continuing support of the show and for passing forward my podcast. My podcast has grown only because of my listeners. So I just want to give you a moment to tell you how much I appreciate you and what you have done for me to help me grow. And I'm excited to say that I am now a featured creator on Fireside. Fireside is an app that allows the audience to be part of the process. So I will be hosting shows over on Fireside where you can listen live to the show. You can also ask questions of the guests. If you find me on Instagram at Dr. Amy Robbins, you can link to my Fireside bio there, and you'll be able to download the app through that. Also, if you haven't subscribed to my newsletter yet, please do so at dramyrobbins.com. I'm going to be switching to bi-weekly newsletters, so you won't be getting them weekly anymore, but you will be getting bi-weekly newsletters with my soul wisdom and other fun tidbits that I'm going to bring to you all. So go ahead, follow me on Instagram, find me on Fireside. You will also still be able to hear your podcasts as you are used to listening to them on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. But Fireside gives you the opportunity to listen live with me. So I would love to have you come join me over there. DM me if you have any questions. And thanks again for your continued support. So this book is fiction, but it is based on the true story of your family and struggles in Nazi Germany and being refugees. Can you speak to what that experience was like? Because they escaped before the war, correct?
Right. They did. Actually, so both sides of my family, my father's side and my mother's side, lived in Frankfurt in Germany. And my father's family ended up fleeing to England right before the war. I mean, they just made it out. And my mother's family ended up fleeing to Switzerland. And it's interesting because later they didn't know each other in Frankfurt. The families didn't know each other. But later they met in England when my mother was training, when my mother was a figure skater. They met in England. So anyway, the book is, in a way, it's my grandmother's story, my grandmother on my mother's side. And she had a sister who was mentally ill in Germany in the 30s, which was a pretty horrific time to be mentally ill. My grandmother tried everything to help her sister. I mean, she did her research. She got the best doctors. They eventually had Rigmore in one of the premier mental institutions called Sonnenstein. And unfortunately, because of some of the Nazis' decrees at that time, she was sterilized. So in 1933, the Nazis came up with their sterilization law, and all sorts of people were sterilized. It could be for alcoholism. There's even for idleness, for feeble-mindedness, for blindness, deafness, any kind of mental illness. And then, of course, that led to their euthanasia program. So my grandmother left Germany with my mother, but she lost everything, really. I mean, she lost her social standing. Her husband stayed in Germany for a variety of reasons. And I think then she just closed that part of her life off. I mean, she compartmentalized it. And then she basically became kind of controlling and rigid, and which makes sense to me because there was so much she couldn't control in Germany and so much tragedy and so much that went wrong that she sort of tried to control all the little things. I mean, her clocks in her house had to go off at exactly the same time every day. You know, she became sort of a perfectionist of the little things. And then much later, I also struggled with mental illness, mostly depression. And but I didn't know it until I ended up in a mental hospital. I just thought I was weak, and my family would tell me to pull up my socks and not be so oversensitive, and I was barely hanging on. I was felt like I was on a tightrope all the time. I couldn't drive anymore. I had panic attacks if I went to the grocery store, and I thought this was like mid 24-ish, 25. I was like, well, I felt weak and incapable of almost anything. And I thought, well, I know what I'll do to fix this. I'll have a baby, which probably wasn't the best idea, but was the greatest gift, right? So I had a baby. The postpartum depression then hit on top of the regular depression, and I ended up in a mental hospital. And when I was in a mental hospital, I mean, all the doctors, one of the things I'm sure they asked, is there any mental illness in your family? And I was like, no, absolutely not. My family's perfect. There's nothing. It's me. I'm the weakling. And what happened during that time is my grandmother and my mother came to help me. Initially, they couldn't talk to me at all. They were so terrified that I was in a mental hospital because of what had happened to my grandmother's sister. But that was a big secret. Nobody knew that. I certainly didn't know that. But eventually they did reveal it. And for me, that was a huge turning point. I wasn't alone. I wasn't, some like just, I don't know. I don't even know what the word is, but I wasn't alone. I felt like, yeah, I am part of this family. And then it became clear that, there's depression that runs in the family. And certainly Rigmore, that was my grandmother's sister's name, suffered from that. Anyway, that was a sort of a long answer to your question.
Well, it's interesting because I think my curiosity is like, how do you think, because you described, was it your mom or your grandma that was like really rigid about the clocks and
My grandmother,
your grandmother?
Okay, so I think that really she's the central character in the book. And, because of what happened to her in Germany, then she sort of closed down, put away that was not talked about, just absolutely never talked about. It wouldn't have been talked about unless I went into a hospital. I mean, that secret would have died with them.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think in order to help me, and I think it was very painful, obviously, for my grandmother to reveal this and to have to, go back and look at the past and, sort of relive how painful it was. But she did it in order to help me. And it really brought the whole family into the light. It was, and I'm sure you've seen this and heard this, sometimes when one family member ends up in a mental hospital, the whole family sort of, if they're willing to, they end up discussing what happened, and they end up like sort of growing and actually being able to love in a more genuine, less fearful way.
Yeah, I mean, I think when people can come together in that way and open up, and, a lot of times in a family, one person ends up being like a container for everybody else's,
Right.
All of their unprocessed
Right.
stuff.
Exactly. Right.
And so that's sort of what I was wondering is, and I often wonder this with, particularly, I think families who've experienced, intergenerational trauma.
Right.
Is how much is, you have this predisposition, right? Her sister suffered from depression, and you're raised in an environment where there's secrets and there's had to be, I'm sure your grandma suffered from tremendous
Right.
grief
Right.
and depression after
Right.
maybe not clinical, but certainly I would imagine she was grieving and just a lot of unprocessed stuff, and how we energetically pick up on that, whether it's outwardly them sharing with us, whether it's the genetic piece, or whether we just know it in our DNA that that is part of our story, and how that changes and can change the chemistry in your brain. But it, like, there's so many components to it. So how do
Right.
you see it?
So I do think children are real barometers of sort of the climate of the family, right? I mean, I didn't know any of the details or what was going on, but certainly I picked up on the fear and the secrecy and absolutely picked up on the shame. And I think you talk about, yes, certainly there are genetic things that are passed down. And I do think that in my family, there was a predisposition for genetic depression. But I think even more importantly, sometimes we overlook that things such as fear and shame get passed down. And sometimes those are actually the more dangerous things that get passed on. And, children know that. They sense that there's something wrong. And it's worse when it's a secret, because they're sensing all this stuff and it doesn't make sense because nothing's being talked about. And I remember this was even later when I was in college, and I had this chemistry professor, and he was a wonderful man. And, I did well in chemistry. And, I remember one test in particular, I finished really quickly, and he was like, well, how do you think you did? And I was like, well, I probably failed. Right. And I didn't. I got them all right. And so he suggested I seek counseling because he clearly saw that, there was something with my self-esteem. And I went home to my mother, and who was pretty, seemed pretty open and generous and, willing to listen to everything. And I said, this chemistry teacher suggested I seek a counselor. And she's very unlike her. She slammed the door on my face and was like, no child of mine shall ever see someone like that. So she knew a little. She didn't know all the details, but she knew that my great aunt had been basically murdered by the Nazis, pre-World War II. And, mental illness was terrifying. It sort of was equated with death and murder. And, she was terrified for her children. So, it was passed down to her. And then when it was passed down to me and my siblings, now I don't know why, like, the others didn't pick it up the way I did. You know what I mean? Like, why does that happen? I don't know. I was definitely the more sensitive one, which my father did not approve of. And I was, you think, you're called, oh, you're oversensitive. And now you think about that. Well, that's a wonderful thing to be, but that wasn't the case. I was oversensitive. And
Well, yeah, and I think that just speaks to, I did an episode not that long ago about epigenetics and how you can
right,
change your genetics,
right,
or how the environment can impact the genetics.
right.
And I think this is a perfect example of that. It's like, you have how many siblings?
I have three. Yeah.
3 siblings. So if there's 4 of you total,
Right.
and you are the only one that suffered from depression in this way,
Yes. Yes.
which is so interesting. I mean, it's such an interesting case study in that
Right.
regard. It's like,
Right.
what was genetically already there, and what were you sensing and picking up on as a sensitive child?
Right.
The energy that you were likely picking up on, the shame, the fear, the just probably paralyzation of
Right.
everything.
Right. Right. No, I'm sure I was. And, and thankfully my mother and grandmother were courageous enough, and it was really hard for them to really reveal what had happened, because when it all made sense, it didn't immediately cure my depression. I went to therapy, I took medication, but boy, it made a huge difference. Like, then I really understood why I was who I was.
Mm-hmm. So, so share with us a bit because you integrated a paranormal storyline in the
Yes.
book. Share
Yes.
with us a bit about that and what made you do that.
There are a number of reasons. So, number one, I think, well, maybe not number one, but I am fascinated with the paranormal. And after I was in, now I'm a science teacher, okay, and I'm saying that for a reason. Because my family, I come from this really long line of, very intellectual scientists.
Well, your dad was a theoretical nuclear
Yeah.
physicist. I mean, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can't even get past that part.
Yeah. Well, actually, you know what? If you're interested in the paranormal, it's very, not that my father was, or not that his work in particular was that, but physicists now, and especially, theoretical physicists, are looking at, and I'm not gonna tell you that physicists all believe in the paranormal, but they are looking at these correlations, and it is very interesting to read about what some of the physicists are theorizing these days on that, as an aside. But anyway, I don't know where I was going with this.
I'm working on trying to get someone on the show to talk about that from a either
Oh,
quantum
good.
physics. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we were talking about you integrating that piece into the book.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry. I get myself off track, and then I'm like, where was I? It's like,
I'm used to getting people back on track.
Okay, good. Anyway, so after, it's interesting because when I was in McLean, that was a mental hospital I was in Boston. When I came out, I was just, I became myself. It was like I was able to be who I was always meant to be. And one of the things I was meant to be and am is very curious about everything, right? And I met a friend, and he told me his mother was a psychic. And I was like, oh, yeah, no, that doesn't exist. I'm not allowed to believe in that. And he told me some stories, and I was like, ooh, that sounds interesting. So we went to see his mother. This is my first time ever going to see a psychic. And she read regular cards, not tarot cards, which was kind of interesting. And
Like
she
regular
knew,
cards, like playing cards?
yeah. So, regular cards were first invented not for playing cards, they were invented for fortune telling. I mean, we call them playing cards now, but technically they were the first real cards that people used. Anyway, she was just astoundingly gifted. And she was my psychic for 30 years. And it's been a phenomenal journey. She died about a year ago. But through her, I began to open up. And as I tell my students and my children, only a closed mind is certain, right? So you have to be open. And I was open just enough to start. And then, I was fascinated, and I have been fascinated. But anyway, so a little piece of the reason it's in the book is because of my really strong belief in it, and my belief as well that I do believe, my mother and grandmother aren't here, they're on the other side, but I do believe they partly guided me in this process. Now, that's not in the book per se, but the other reason, as far as structure of the book and the story, is that this woman who was in McLean as well, she was there because she lived in a group home, and she knew there was going to be a fire. She was psychic. She knew there was going to be a fire in the group home. She told everybody, and then there was a fire, and then they accused her of starting the fire.
Wait, she was in the home with you?
Yeah, she was in the mental hospital with me. Yeah.
Wow.
So she had visions, paranormal visions, which, some people are going to say are crazy. And again, that's
precognitions, right?
right. Whole other piece in our society, and different in other societies, right? There are some societies where if you have visions like this, you're going to be trained to be a shaman. I mean,
right.
It's a
you're
gift,
like
and
lauded, and people are lining up to see you.
right. But obviously, in this country, I do think we're becoming more open, but it's still, there's still a lot of, yeah, that's not real. But anyway, so she had a vision in the mental hospital when my grandmother was there visiting, of my grandmother's sister. And what it does to the character of my grandmother, it sort of pushes on her even more to become, to make her question, where is this woman who died? Where is this kind of love of her life was her sister in a way, right? And is she still around? And it was important to put that character in that position and push on her boundaries, because one of the themes of the book is that, both the grandmother and the granddaughter have ideas of the other one that aren't the nicest thing. Like the granddaughter thinks that I was the granddaughter, thinks the grandmother's rigid and controlling and doesn't understand why she has all these rules and whatever. And the grandmother doesn't understand why the granddaughter doesn't do her hair more nicely. Obviously, look at my hair, but right.
You have great curly hair.
Right. But the point being that you have to really listen to the other and be open to their experiences, but really understand their fears. And so the whole book really is a trajectory of sorts of openness. And the paranormal piece pushes on those boundaries and sort of makes the grandmother have to be open, a little bit open about that too. How open? She's not going to be open like me about it, maybe, but those are the things that I think are important to question. Again, going back to only a closed mind is certain. We've got to push those boundaries. We've got to understand each other. We have to, be open to the experiences of others.
Well, and I'm just thinking, what was it like for you to be in the hospital with this woman who had this vision of or experience with your grandmother and her sister, and like, how did that get handled by the staff? I think it's so disconcerting in some ways to hear like that you'll just dismiss. I mean, that's her reality. And I understand that there is a thin line between reality and psychosis sometimes. I mean, I've sat with people who have severe schizophrenia, and you can get pulled into those delusions really quickly. I mean, because they're so real to the person that they're sometimes, not always, but their way of expressing it is so real, and that's their reality. But in this case, she knew things that she could not have known.
Right. So in this particular case, and I'm glad you brought that up, because believe me, I don't think people who have psychosis from schizophrenia is not the same as having like messages or whatever from the other side. But this woman, I don't know, she was just dismissed. I mean, she wasn't, I don't know, there was something about her, and she didn't come off as particularly bright. And I think that, so then she was even more easily dismissed. Oh, she's just like, I mean, and that's so sad, really, because she was really gifted.
And so how did that impact, like, this being something that you were curious about, or did it in any way?
It didn't at that time. I mean, that was, it was interesting. I think that I didn't fully understand it all. I didn't fully understand it. It was, but again, okay, so it creates openness, right? It creates an opening, and that's so key in life for me. Like, you create these little openings of curiosity, right? And you follow them, and you should follow them. I tell my students that all the time, like, be curious. Above all, be curious.
I love that.
So that when I did get out of McLean, I was ready to begin to seek these experiences. And I've had like fascinating experiences, both with, psychics and mediums and frauds, which in many ways is really fascinating as well, because I mean, to me, the frauds have like sort of legitimized some of the real people.
The what? What did
The frauds. Sorry, frauds. So I've also
Oh,
had experience.
frauds. I'm like, is she saying frogs?
Yeah,
What
no,
is
I
this frog?
realized that, right, the fraud. So I've had some pretty interesting experiences with frauds. And I think that has legitimized some of the people who are really gifted for me.
So in some of your readings, has your grandmother and great
Great
aunt,
aunt,
have they
right.
come through? And what could do you feel comfortable sharing some of what they have shared?
So I they haven't there my mother comes through much more often and
Okay.
is more specific. I mean, my grandmother comes through sort of as a figure that's standing near my mother. Um, I'm comfortable sharing all my stories because that's who I am. Like I realized, I don't know when, I don't know, it wasn't long ago. I'm like, so what's been the path of my life? It's been one of openness because of the secrecy I grew up in, right? So I sort of, and I know I realize I'm getting a little off track here, but more importantly than anything, I wanted to make sure that I raised my daughters, in a home where they were comfortable with openness, vulnerability. And both my daughters have suffered from, at varying degrees, from some depression and anxiety. And there was no shame for them. And I remember when my eldest daughter was beginning to show signs around 14. I mean, I took her to a therapist, a psychiatrist, and a psychic, right? Like I covered all the bases. And I tell that to my students because, there's help to be had out there. There's great help. And if the first person doesn't work, it doesn't matter. There'll be other people. There'll be a different medication or, there's just so much help and support. You just can't like give up. But anyway, I was going to tell one short story about
Sure,
my,
absolutely.
so this woman, Sophie, who read, as a psychic, but also had mediumship abilities. I remember when Erica, my oldest daughter, was pregnant with her first child, she had just suffered a miscarriage before her pregnancy. And so she was pretty newly pregnant. She had an ultrasound on New Year's Eve in Boston. I happened to be in Chicago. And the technician said something that Erica didn't understand. And Erica called me totally hysterical. She couldn't breathe. She could barely speak. Finally, she said something like the technician said there was like an artery in the baby's head. I was like, that makes no sense. But I was so worried about Erica and about the baby. And I got off the phone, and in my family, there are a number of medical doctors, and I could have called the radiologist, but I called the psychic, right? And I was like, Sophie, you have to help me. And so Sophie read the cards over the phone, and she said, the baby's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with the baby. She said, but Erica can't have sex for 2 weeks. I was like, okay, I can't tell my daughter that. I can't
Right.
say, And Sophie was like, there's nothing wrong with the baby. Something hasn't moved yet. And Erica should not have sex for 2 weeks. You need to tell her that. And I was like, yeah, I can't do that. Erica saw her doctor a couple days later, and the doctor said the baby was totally fine. What the woman had seen was something called an artifact, which is, because they're sound waves, it's not something that has to do with anything but, a reading of the sound waves. But Erica's placenta hadn't moved yet. It was still low lying. So the doctor said, you can definitely have sex, but if you do, chances are you'll spot, and then you'll get you'll get upset, and you'll need to come in for an ultrasound, which is fine. You can do that. But that Sophie had known everything. You know what I mean? She didn't know it was called the placenta, but all these things happen with her all the time. And it fascinates me. I mean, before she died, she had significant dementia, but I would still go and visit her all the time. Not for reading so much, just to bring her cake and, to be there for her. But every time she saw me, she wanted to do a reading.
So she could still do a reading even while she had dementia.
And their readings, here's the thing about them, they were so accurate. I didn't even know how accurate they were till after she died, right? And I mean, the things she told me in the readings that have since come true are so crazy. Like, I'm like, how can I not believe in all of this when this has actually happened,
Well, and what does that say about our brains when you have dementia and you're still able to tap into this part of yourself?
Right. Well, they've done some really interesting studies with that, looking at the brain waves when, like, certain mediums, certain mediums, they've studied their, like, brain activity while they're actually doing or in a trance or mediumship
But I mean,
state.
when you have dementia, like, that's a new level of
right.
research, I feel like.
Right. And I mean, my research is only anecdote. It's research. It is research. I mean, I've collected a ton of data, but it's anecdotal. And as is a lot of this research. But the interesting thing to me too is I love the University of Virginia studies. I don't know if
Bruce Grayson. I had him on.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, he's actually, it's February 25th right now, but he's going to be, because this will air probably in May. He is on my March 4th. He has a new book coming out.
Oh, he does?
Yeah, called After. It's phenomenal. It's a phenomenal book.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love all the work they're doing there. And they have mountains and mountains of research, I mean, and data that they've collected. And, so it's always shocking to me that people still will be like, wait, you believe in that? I'm like, how can you not? If you do your homework, how can you not?
Right. Well, Sylvia, this was so interesting. Where can people find you other than in the classroom teaching remote? Our students are leaders of tomorrow, right? I mean, Thank you. It sounds like you're an amazing teacher too, just in how you talk to them about the world and just
about
being curious
everything.
in it.
Everything. Even though I teach chemistry, we talk about everything. It's fun. I love teaching. I'm so lucky, like, to have fallen into,
God, in high school, no less. Like, I feel like people are just scared of adolescents in general. So,
and they're
even
so
though I have one,
they
are fun. I think
I have a website and at sylviatrue.com, and you can buy the book pretty much anywhere. So Google searches these days are great. I love to hear from people. I'll connect with anybody. Basically.
Oh, I forgot one big piece that's important. That's interesting. Your grandfather was Anne Frank's doctor.
My grandfather on my father's side was the doctor of the whole family in Frankfurt. They fled to Amsterdam, the Frank family, and my father's family fled to England. And my grandfather was one of the kindest, most gentle souls, and he absolutely could not believe and would not believe that humans were going to be or could be as terrible as they ended up being. And he literally had to get pushed on a train to get out of Germany, because he was like, this isn't going to happen. I mean, and we understand that, like, we don't believe people can do horrible things, and they do, and it's crazy.
Did he know this Frank's family story?
Well, he knew it later. Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Yeah. And he was it affected him greatly. Like my father said he died too young because of, the trauma of leaving, but also I think just the sadness of it, of it all.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, if people want to read your fascinating, beautiful story of where madness lies, they can find you. You told us on Google, they can Google you, and I will have all the links also listed in my show notes.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time today. I hope I didn't run into any of your course time or anything.
No. I juggle many things.
Well, thank you.
All right.
Like what you heard today and want to hear more? Wondering what comes next and what it all means? Head over to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Also, if you could take a minute to rate and review my podcast, I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned as we continue to explore life, death, and the space between.